Everybody. This is the webinar series, Topics at the Nexus of Climate Change, Fisheries, and Blue Foods. And the series is really designed to highlight the impacts of climate change on fisheries, aquaculture, and communities who depend on them. The webinar series is jointly hosted by the UN Ocean Decade Program's Blue Food Futures, Fisheries Strategies for Changing Oceans and Resilient Ecosystems, or FishSCORE, Sustainability, Predictability, and Resilience of Marine Ecosystems, or SUPREME, Sustainability of Marine Ecosystems through Global Knowledge Networks, or SmartNet, and Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project, FishMIP, and the endorsed project Basin Scale Events to Coastal Impacts, or BECI. There's a link in the chat to find out more about the programs that are co-hosting the webinar. And this month, we are focusing on increasing resilience and food security through inclusive fisheries governance in Greenland and Canada. We're hosting two speakers today, Jay Kim, who is presenting on achieving Arctic indigenous self-sufficiency, and Evan Andrews, who's presenting on toward fish harmony, governance innovation for regenerative fisheries. There will be time for questions after each presenter, and please use the Q&A box to ask your questions. We're not able to have people speak verbally or to use the chat, so please do put your questions into the Q&A box. Our first speaker today is Jay Kim. Jay is a PhD candidate at the University of Maine and a research associate in the Coastal and Marine Economics Lab at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. Their research explores knowledge production of fisheries resilience under climate change. They utilize inter and multidisciplinary approaches to understand climate change impacts on socioeconomic coastal systems through quantitative and qualitative methods. And their work focuses primarily on the American lobster fishery in the Gulf of Maine, as well as South Greenland indigenous fishing and hunting communities. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jay. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Kathy. It's great to be here. I'll wait for these slides to get up. That is the very end. Could we go back to the beginning? Great, thank you so much. Hi everyone, my name is Jay Kim. I'm a research associate here at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and I'll be talking to you about my work in Greenland or South Greenland about looking at indigenous self-sufficiency, primarily in fishing and hunting through fisheries and hunting communities. And this is work that I've been doing for a while as part of my graduate studies and hoping to transition this into a much more formal project through FishSCORE relatively soon is the idea. Next. The work started off as part of the systems approaches to understanding and navigating the new Arctic, or SANA National Research Traineeship, NRT. Basically, it's this big NNA grant that sent students over to Greenland to look at interdisciplinary ways of understanding the Arctic systems. Next, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so I, coming with a background in fisheries and interdisciplinary studies, reached out to some folks in Greenland, and I was connected to an economic development group called Innovation South Greenland in Kokotag. And through them and through my friend Eric, who was the main fisheries coordinator there, we were able to set up, we were able to build and really develop this collaborative research effort that's still ongoing. Next slide. Through the help of Eric, we first decided that the studies, the NNA grant wanted it to be about climate change, but upon talking to folks there, it really was more about self-sufficiency in the context of climate change. So we explored this idea. We came up with a definition for self-sufficiency, next, which for us, it meant the ability to sustain oneself and livelihood, the ability to earn income, so ability to sustain oneself and livelihood, which includes but not is limited to the ability to earn income, access food, and practice culture. And this definition is built around concepts of food sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty, and food security. Next. And in the Inuit context, it really encompasses a lot of Inuit culture, recognizing that food is such a big part of the Arctic way of life. And food isn't necessarily just subsistence, but it's also part of economy, it's part of culture, it's part of trade, and it's been that way for 1,000 years. And so you have fishers who their main job is to fish and hunt and sell food to the market. But as part of the cultural exchange, is also giving food to communities and family. It's part of continuing traditions and educating the youth about how to connect to their Inuit roots and to access the food and the nature they have around them. Next, please. And so the research design that we came up with next is we really focused on the idea of co-production of knowledge. Back in 2023, I went there in person to conduct 6 interviews with 6 hunters and fishermen from 2 major regions around South Greenland, Nasak and Kokotuk. They have very specific infrastructure and histories about fishing and hunting in that region that makes them so central. I asked them questions about climate change. We asked them questions about impacts to fishing and hunting and impacts to self-sufficiency. This was really helpful to have Eric as part of the project because he does know everyone there. And we were able to talk to some really key people, elders or people of leadership in these fishing and hunting groups in the area, as well as people who fill multiple roles, such as food processors, people who work at the meat factory, people who grow their own food, people who are part of the seafood market and trade, for example. Next slide, please. Next. And so back in 2000, we conducted that research. We found the results. We presented on it many different times. And then we did a follow-up research trip back in 2025, where we met with a lot of the same hunters and fishers in Kokotuk, as well as some new folks. Next. What we did for this research trip is we shared the research that we did, where we talked about the results that we found, how we've been communicating them, how this research has been shared, and how it's been received by the international audience. It was a big part of the reciprocity of doing Indigenous research, where you get the results and you make sure that the people you're working with are able to understand and consume and have the results themselves. Next. As part of this trip, we gathered feedback from the community about if the results actually represent what they think, if anything has changed in the past couple of years, if they feel like the research was done ethically, if it feels like they see themselves reflected in the results, and what the next steps, like what we could have done better, what we could do differently, and what the next steps should be. Next, please. And so the results grow quickly, whereas we identified both barriers to self-sufficiency and ways to improve self-sufficiency in a fishery-specific context in South Greenland. The TLDR is that climate change happens and people are adaptable, but the problem is the way that people can adapt to these changes are severely limited by both by legacy and recent examples of colonial management systems in the area. Examples could be like quota systems or veterinary restrictions for selling meat products that prevent hunters and fishermen from being able to actually access markets. So they could see the fish, but they can't catch it. And if they could, they wouldn't be able to sell the fish. So it ends up being at multiple stages of both production to consumption, there are some sort of regulatory barriers that isn't locally informed, that isn't indigenous, and is really hard to change. We also translated these results into Greenlandic next, where we were able to share this with the folks there. Next slide. So those were some of the barriers. We looked at some of the ways to improve the self-sufficiency based on the interviews that we conducted. And the big theme of ways to improve it is having indigenous like decolonizing the management structures and having indigenous knowledge and indigenous decision making as part of the regulatory management structures, which means that having indigenous knowledge for these seasonally relevant changes and times, allowing for indigenous decision making in terms of how much fish to catch, what sort of fish to catch, what kind of meat to sell, and where these products can be accessed. And this was also translated into Greenlandic next. And to go over the big four, next slide. Next, we looked at ways to improve infrastructure, which could include improving tools, but really specifically looking at like improving facilities and having processing factories, having abilities for people to be able to actually get their products out to market. Next, we looked at ways of indigenizing regulations for code management and specifically for having seasonally relevant and climate change informed harvest. Next, we looked at ways of improving knowledge and access to Greenlandic food and culture, recognizing that a part of the legacy of colonialism is that you have a population that isn't knowledgeable or able to support traditional ways of life. And as life changes, the cultural education is such a big part of still allowing for this climate informed and seasonally relevant harvest to continue to happen. And then next, finally, in addition to the education would be actually getting access to markets, not just for producers, but consumers as well. If you have people who are much more willing to consume Greenlandic foods, then you can support producers who want to produce traditional foods. Next slide. Next, please. We got really good positive feedback. We talked about the people that we talked to re-emphasized the importance of both colonization and climate change as important barriers to self-sufficiency, but recognizing that, again, climate happens and the way that people need to change need to be flexible. People felt that their voices were heard and represented, and we had really positive community engagement with not just the hunters and fishers, but the rest of the towns as well. Next slide. And so what goes on, what happens after this work? Well, we're talking about the things that we want to do with work with FishSCORE is look at ways to actually have proper indigenous co-management. And we want to build out a framework based on work from this region where we work with the hunters and fishermen to actually figure out what are the ways in which we can actually have indigenous co-management. Next. And so we can work with the same people or more to identify areas in which indigenous knowledge can be incorporated into management. We can also identify areas where current management is lacking and what are the indigenous alternatives to management. And so that includes examples like different forms of communication for understanding when somebody is harvesting too much or when they're not harvesting enough. Next. And this is really built on the focus of having the locally informed data and having climate ready solutions and adaptation strategies to things that might happen in the future. And this work, the idea is that as we build out this framework, we will also really prioritize both the self-sufficiency and conservation aspects of fisheries management because world politics is complicated and you can't just forego the idea of fisheries management for conservation. Next slide. Next. And so what are the next steps? Next, please. We want to publish a lot of the work that we've done as part of both an academic paper as well as policy recommendations in a policy brief. And ideally, we will be able to get those out to people or in positions of power to actually affect management. That's both locally within Greenland as well as internationally in the ICES community. We have presented this and we will hope to continue to present this at relevant conferences, which includes things like ICES or the Arctic Science Summit Week. There is communities for the University of the Arctic, as well as national Greenland science conferences. And the idea is that it's not just insulated in Greenland, but we should also be able to work with communities outside of Greenland in other Arctic areas as well. The biggest challenge right now is finding funding sources because, as people might be aware, the current global geopolitics of the US relationships with Greenland is not friendly. And it makes it really difficult to think about continuing to do research that endorses indigenous sovereignty, where my nation is actively not doing that. So we'll see what happens. Ideally, we will be looking at funding sources from outside the US, which is where the FishSCORE endorsement really comes into play. And next, please. One more time, sorry. Well, and then, yeah, that would be the end of my presentations. If you have any questions, after this, you can reach out to either me or Eric, who've also been pretty involved in the whole research process about any questions about what we want to do here or what Greenland is doing about this. And thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay. We do invite questions, and we have plenty of time for questions from people who are attending the webinar. So please type your questions into the Q&A box. We do have one there that's currently waiting from Jackie Vogel. Thank you, Jackie. Jackie says, "Hi, Jay. Can you provide some background on the Greenlandic fisheries governance structure? I'm not familiar with the current balance of Danish, Greenlandic, local, and Indigenous rights in fisheries decision making." So I think that would be really
Yeah,
helpful for a lot of us. Thank you.
yeah, no, it is really complicated. So the history of it is sometime in the 80s, Greenland declared home was granted home rule, which allows them to have their own self-government. Until then, they were considered a colony or part of the Kingdom of Denmark. They still are considered a Kingdom of Denmark, but they are their own autonomous self-governing territory, no longer necessarily a colony. Within that, it got amended in 2009 to allow for more control over domestic resources. That includes minerals and land resources all below the ice sheet, as well as within their what could be considered like EEZ. This is where it sort of gets complicated because you have Greenland-owned companies like Royal Greenland, which is the biggest fisheries producer and shipper that is 100% Greenlandic owned, but is a colonial legacy of a Danish company, which means that there's still a lot of Danish people in power. Doesn't mean it's completely bad, but it does mean it makes it difficult to have indigeneity in decision making all the way up to the very top. In addition to those sort of barriers, you have things like Greenland has control over its own domestic production, but it doesn't have control over its international shipping. So any product that leaves Greenland has to more or less go through Copenhagen first. And so what ends up happening is you have like these sort of like feedback systems where you have fish that's caught in Greenland by Royal Greenland at the Danish that's being processed in Greenland but gets shipped to Denmark, and then Denmark packages and reships it either back to Greenland and the rest of the world. And ends up being there's there's laws about which percentages of fish needs to be landed on Greenland shores. Before, it used to be all just processed and caught at sea. There's differences between large-scale fleets, so like big boats versus small inshore fleet, which are significant and important, but because a lot of them are like tiny little boats, and you have a lot of people who either hunt and fish technically recreationally, but also for subsistence and contribute to the meat sharing community, but not necessarily sell to market. You have levels of harvest that may or may not be tracked. And because of the way that fisheries management works, if you're taking a precautionary approach, we're just assuming it's all getting harvested. And so you have people in Greenland who are setting quotas who are really just taking IC's recommendations, who really aren't being informed by what's happening locally, and we don't know who, what, where is catching who, what, how. And we don't know how much of that is being shared. And despite all that, a lot of the resources that are being harvested can't actually be realized into profit in such a way that's useful for communities. And so you end up still having these informal trade-based, what could even be considered, like you have these informal trade-based economies that are significant for the region to thrive, but we have no way of actually understanding how those could be regulated from a top-down outside perspective, which is why it's really important to have local indigenous co-management in these regions so that people can actually make decisions about the resources that they're using locally versus non-locally. Sorry, that was a really long, complicated answer to a really long, complicated problem.
Thank you, Jay. We have another question from Marta Pukserver. Thank you very much, Jay. Fantastic work. In your research, have you already observed any adaptations that fishers have made to the effects of climate change? And could there be a risk of maladaptation in some responses? You already
Yeah,
explained a little, but if you can give some more insight, that would be great. Thanks.
yeah, of course. Great question. Very simple, like tactical responses could be like people talked about how with the ice sheets melting and the freshwater influx, the streams or the currents in the fjord are changing. And it's not changing at when they're supposed to. And you have way more icebergs in the water when they're not supposed to be there. And so that changes many things about how one can fish using the equipment that they have. So they change how they're fishing and the type of species that they're targeting, but you also have like whales get trapped out by the icebergs, so they can't come into the bays, which means hunters have to then risk more going further out of the fjord to catch whales and seals, for example. That's very local, direct sort of thing in which how people are adapting. Maladaptations could be something like where you have, it's not necessarily an maladaptation, but an inability to adapt. One of the biggest things that people have mentioned were the discrepancies between what they see and the quota limitations. And that's anywhere from polar bears all the way to like duck eggs to like seagull eggs. And then seals are a little different, but you have things like lumpfish roe, where it has a high market price and you're seeing a lot of lumpfish, but because they don't have the quota, they can't catch it, and then you have to try to catch cod in the time that you have, and that creates really bad incentives for people to target things that aren't seasonally relevant, that might actually be hurting ecosystems rather than helping.
Great, thank you, Jay. I'm going to actually ask a question that kind of relates to the adaptation question, but I'm curious if you have seen or heard of many communities who are starting to have new species show up that they aren't familiar with, and how that's affecting the cultural landscape and the cultural use of resources.
Yeah, no, especially in South Greenland, because it's so much warmer than the rest of the Greenland continent, Greenland ice sheet, they see the changes much quicker. Examples, not fish-wise, would be agriculture. It's the only place where you can farm in Greenland, so people are experimenting with growing new crops and having more sheep and different feeding strategies and allowing for like more production land-wise. And they've been really successful in doing that. But then conversely, there's now more drought and then more flooding events, which actually makes it really dangerous to use the landscape as the glaciers melt at an accelerated rate. So things to consider. Fisheries wise, they've talked about seeing shifts in cod. Greenland has experienced multiple shifts, specifically big regime changes and cod to shrimp and then back to cod. Narwhals and like most whale species have shifted north, except there's now other whales that are coming in to the south because there's more whales, there's more seals. And they've also talked about a lot of like subarctic species that they've been seeing. The possibilities of tuna coming up to Greenland waters is a very real thing, and people are really interested in catching tuna because that's a really high market value fish. But the tuna quotas internationally set are also equally complicated. So like how do you insert Greenland into this space is a question I don't know how to answer.
Interesting. Yes, lots of complications and many layers to all of
It's
those.
mostly like a policy problem at times.
All right, we have a couple more minutes if anyone has any questions to ask in the Q&A box. Give this just a little bit, and then we will switch to our second presentation. Okay, I'm not seeing anything pop up immediately, and we should have time at the very end for questions to both presenters. So if you do have any additional questions for Jay, please feel free to type them in, and we will come back to them. So at this point, though, we're going to switch to our second presenter, Evan Andrews, who is a marine social scientist and governance researcher affiliated with Memorial University of Newfoundland. His work focuses on fisheries and ocean governance with a particular emphasis on regenerative and community-centered approaches in small-scale fisheries and coastal regions. He plays leadership roles in collaborative initiatives, including Rethinking Transformation, Moving Together for Marine Conservation, and Too Big to Ignore in Canada. Drawing on interactive governance and transdisciplinary research, his work examines how institutions, policy processes, and innovation spaces can better support equity, dignity, and community-embedded actions in fisheries and ocean governance amid climate change, competing avenues for sustainable development and marine conservation. So with that, Evan, please take it away, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to be here. Although I feel like I want to talk to Jay for the next 30 minutes about Greenland stuff. But today I'm going to share with you something a little bit different, which is a proposal. It's one that is being collaboratively designed that by a number of folks in Canada and around the world that helps respond to the persistent and growing challenge in fisheries and oceans governance, including in Canada, and to get us thinking collectively about the future of fisheries and what is indeed possible given what we're now expecting of them in the context of marine conservation, sustainable development, and climate action. So currently, we're developing a proposal for a stage one, a SSHRC partnership grant aimed at cross-sector co-creation of knowledge and understanding. So we ask that it's a wonderful opportunity to share these ideas here. And if you want to follow up or participate or take them out on your own, just reach out to me and I would be happy to connect to you. Um, so the proposal, the work that we're proposing is called Fish Harmony Partnership, Governance Innovation for Regenerative Fisheries. So I wanted to share today so you can see what we're up to, how a group of us are thinking about fisheries and governance in Canada, and introduce this new effort to you. And with the hopes that we'll get some interesting questions and maybe some follow-up after on. I'm doing this on behalf of some other folks involved in this effort, including Brennan Lowry and Ratana Champagdi, as well as a list of about 40 individuals from 11 universities and non-academic institutions, and a growing list of partners ranging from Indigenous knowledge sharers and leaders, federal government organizations, NGOs, and community and regional groups. Thank you. Next slide, please. And this one is a quick one. So the Fish Harmony Partnership asks two questions. What are regenerative fisheries in Canada and perhaps even the world? And how do we align or create harmony between fisheries governance with the regenerative potential that exists in the oceans, especially in the context of climate change, competing ocean uses, and profound social, cultural, and institutional complexity? Next slide, please. Like other nations globally, Canada is a nation of coasts. Along three ocean regions, fisheries connect communities, economies, cultures, and ecosystems. They remain among the most place-dependent livelihoods in the country, supporting food security and employing approximately 70,000 people. At the same time, fisheries are operating under intensifying pressures, especially if you look along the value chains. These include climate-driven ecological change, cumulative effects from multiple ocean uses, conservation commitments which reshape access, and long-standing governance conflicts. These pressures are not new, but their pace and intensity are. And so the central idea here is that if we want to explore what the fisheries can be in the future and all of the potential co-benefits that might come with this idea of regenerative fisheries, which I'll speak about later, we need both a new way to talk and look at them, as well as potentially a new way to govern them. Despite substantial effort by governments, Indigenous peoples, communities, and civil society, current fisheries and oceans governance remains ill-suited to the challenge to respond to the dynamics, complexities that exists on the ocean and on the coasts. For example, institutional rigidity, siloed decision-making, and a reliance generally on incremental reform have limited the ability of governance systems to adapt. Simply adding more voices to existing structures has often failed to resolve conflict or unlock innovation. What's required here is not just better management, but governance transformation, capable of learning, coordinating, and responding to the lived and experienced realities of fishery systems. And governance systems here are people and groups working together through formal and informal rules, relationships, and decision-making processes to identify problems and create solutions. In this context, there is a strong role for social scientists and other transdisciplinary scholars and practitioners to help imagine parallel and complementary governance approaches to inform the future. And this is where the concept of regenerative fisheries becomes central. In dominant sustainability narratives, fisheries are often framed primarily as drivers of overfishing, ecological degradation, and often pinned in conflict with other objectives like conservation. Certainly, there are fisheries operating at certain scales and certain practices that are contributing to these challenges. However, these narratives are heavily shaped by the experiences of large-scale industrial fisheries and by governance metrics that struggle to account for the diversity, context, and social meaning. In parallel, blue economy narratives frequently marginalize fisheries, particularly small-scale, community-based, and treaty fisheries, casting them as inefficient or incompatible with innovation. We use categories like small scale or large scale in the literature to try to unpack some of these distinguishing features. But in practice, these fisheries are categorized by legal and policy systems, and there's a challenge in aligning and thinking through all these together, a real one that's based in policy and decision-making in institutions. None of these ways of talking about fisheries may get at the central need, which is that fisheries, if appropriately constituted and effectively positioned along local value chains, can be part of the solution. Next slide, please. The Fish Harmony Partnership builds on a growing evidence that challenges these framings and leverages emerging studies and dialogue. Research increasingly demonstrates that fisheries can be, and in many cases already are, part of the solution to sustainability, conservation, and climate challenges. Emerging scholarship, such as that by Phil Loring and others, reframes these fisheries as regenerative, working in systems in which livelihoods are aligned with ecosystem restoration, climate adaptation and mitigation, and place-based stewardship, among other benefits. Importantly, regenerative fisheries are not defined by size or gear type. They're defined by the qualities of relationships people have with ecosystems, between governance systems, and the lived realities of fishing, and of course, ambitiously between the present state and future conditions. However, realizing the regenerative potential of fisheries is a governance problem. It depends on governance that can match and respond to ecological diversity, to social cultural difference which comes together in the same space, to economic realities, to indigenous rights to fisheries and self-determination. Through a major knowledge synthesis effort, we've identified 50 articles that highlight these malalignments, misfits, and tensions. Through conversation, with 2,000 community, indigenous, government, and NGO folks during a major outreach effort, these malalignments are also signaled and experienced. This places governance, not just management, at the center of transformation and building harmony between governance and the lived realities in fisheries as the key goal. The Fish Harmony Partnership responds to this challenge by foregrounding governance innovation at the bioregional scale. While many innovative practices exist at local levels, they often fail to scale or to influence national policy. A major barrier is the absence of sort of meso-level arena capable of bridging local initiatives and centralized decision-making, and helping to ground in justice and equity the commitments and targets to which at least the Canadian government has made with respect to fisheries and oceans. The bioregion represents a space where ecological processes, community practices, indigenous territories, and policy mandates intersect. At the same time, bioregional governance remains poorly supported by existing institutions, even though there are some historical and even emerging counterexamples upon which these ideas in the proposal build. What we need to do is think about what actually this bioregional scale might look like if we want governance to be interactive, multi-level, future-facing, holistic, grounded in the relationships that matter, and also capable of change. Next slide, please. The overarching goal of Fish Harmony is to unlock the potential of regenerative fisheries in Canada by innovating governance systems so that they are better aligned with the ecological, social, cultural, and economic realities of coastal and ocean systems. The partnership works then to foster the conditions for fisheries that are already regenerative to thrive, for fisheries that are not yet regenerative to develop pathways towards regeneration, and for governance systems themselves to build the capacities needed to support these futures over time. Guided by transdisciplinary co-production approaches, the partnership is advancing 5 interdependent objectives. The first is to assess the regenerative potential of fisheries and the governability of governance systems in key bioregions. The second is to co-develop, pilot, and evaluate governance innovations that respond to these identified mismatches. The third is to strengthen governance capacity through co-learning, mentorship, as well as attention to power, legitimacy, and relationships. The fourth is about generating integrative insights, strategies, frameworks, and tools for the long-term future. And finally, the partnership will be about mobilizing and sharing knowledge through inclusive, relational, and accessible approaches that support learning and dialogue across regions, sectors, and institutions. Next slide. Fish Harmony is focusing on 4 bioregions across Canada's Atlantic and Pacific coasts: the South Salish Sea on the Pacific, the Bay of Fundy, the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the south coast of Newfoundland and Labrador in the Atlantic. These regions are biophysically and institutionally diverse, yet they do share some echoing challenges related to mobilizing climate action, to fisheries conservation tensions, the challenges of cumulative effects, governance fragmentation, and so on. And therefore, bringing them together provides a basis for comparative learning while maintaining strong place-based relevance. In these regions, we will be assessing regenerative fisheries and governance capacities. We'll be co-developing governance innovations with a focus on capacity building, as well as piloting and evaluating these innovations together with researchers and practitioners and many others, hoping that we can envision governance systems at work with the best practice qualities that many people have recommended, like being holistic, relational, and reflexive. Next slide, please. Through the research, we'll be looking at 5 cross-cutting themes to guide the work. The first is about freedom and power, which examines how authority, voice, and resources are distributed across fisheries governance systems and how these distributions shape legitimacy, accountability, and the ability to pursue long-term stewardship. The second is about intergenerational and youth co-leadership, focusing on the meaningful involvement of youth in governance alongside structured exchange of knowledge, responsibility, and leadership across generations. The third is on Indigenous wisdom and local knowledge, which foregrounds diverse knowledge systems rooted in long-term relationships with place, including related to Indigenous laws, values, and responsibilities tied to rights and self-determination, while also not leaving behind the traditional local non-Indigenous coastal community knowledge that is also grounded in the need for recognition, protection, and mobilization. The fourth is around transdisciplinary capacity and relational accountability. It examines the trust, skills, networks, and institutional supports required for sustained collaboration across actors, sectors, and scales. It also brings in the notion of relational governance. It's asking questions like, what capacities and relationships are weak, missing, or malaligned? Or where are they strong? And finally, the last theme is on community-embedded innovation in institutions, understanding how coastal social and policy innovations, for example, reintroducing direct sales, efforts to shorten seafood supply chains, can inform broader governance while challenging inequities. These themes come together to structure shared assessment, guide co-design, and inform the evaluation of governance innovations across the phases of the partnership. And there are going to be 3 phases with integration checkpoints along the way. Next slide, please. Phase 1 is about co-identifying problems, focusing on assessing the regenerative potential and identifying key governability challenges through collaboratively designed assessments, as well as things like interviews and workshops. Phase 2 is about co-creating responses, which centers on the design of place-based governance interventions at the bioregional scale, informed by, but not prescribed by, existing experiments such as co-governance bodies, bioregional forums, governance labs, as well as reconciliation and practice processes. Phase 3 is about co-piloting those innovations, moving from theory and evidence into practice, which involves testing, adapting, and evaluating governance arrangements through methods such as scenario development and comparison, process tracing, decision theater simulations, as well as other Indigenous and locally informed approaches. These will be selected, of course, based on the bioregional needs and priorities. Across all these phases, the emphasis is on learning by doing, being reflexive, being adaptive. Our impact, we're hoping, is not understood only in terms of the discrete outputs that you might expect with a research partnership, but in terms of whether we can actually change the conditions for governance. And we have good evidence that this group is capable of moving the needle towards strengthened relationships, improved coordination, enhanced legitimacy, and creating the durable capacities that persist beyond the life of the project. Last slide, please. Fish Harmony is designed to contribute socially, culturally, economically, and intellectually by strengthening governance capacity in support of regenerative futures for fisheries, with many possibilities to think beyond the fishing context. It responds to a nationally significant challenge while generating insights transferable to other regions. It's grounded in the Canadian context although it includes bioregions that have transboundary implications. It speaks directly to the goals of the need to build learning networks to shift how we think about the scientific foundations of fisheries by looking at the implementation seriously, by envisioning, applying, and refining new frameworks while looking at the practice that's needed to keep them on the ground and keep them with strong fidelity to what's happening on coasts and oceans. And ultimately, it's looking at advancing equitable, integrated fisheries futures. In particular, Fish Harmony contributes a governance-centered regenerative lens that complements climate action work, marine conservation effort, and the global commitments for sustainability. By advancing this work in Canada, we're hoping that this partnership will become a platform for strengthening the coasts, for encouraging North American collaboration and possibility, and for translating important knowledge into action through the integration of research and practice in the pursuit of building a durable coalition for the future. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Evan. There is a lot to think about in what you just presented. And so thank you for inspiring us to think about other potential ways of viewing fisheries and governing them. If there are questions from the audience, please be sure to type them into the Q&A box. And I'll just start with one because I do think there is potentially a strong connection to some of the other work that we are doing in FishSCORE around co-management. And I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about how you're learning from other regions. Are there regions to learn from? And what are you trying to draw together in terms of understanding potentially suitable or pieces that you might want to take of systems that are in place in other regions that might be relevant to the areas that you're working in Canada?
Sure, I'm happy to. This ideation or the ideas for this partnership are not about replacing co-management or replacing the hard work and hard-won effort often by Indigenous peoples in Canada to have greater say. It's about trying to look more broadly at the governance system overall, in which co-management is often plugged in, which creates some challenges for the full realization of the authority and power sharing intent behind co-management. In Canada, the federal government has strong hierarchical power, and you can see through many conflicts and tensions that have happened that despite the intention and even agreement to co-manage, there are still challenges in realizing that. Then the question is, what does that actually really look like in a multi-scale, multi-use ocean environment where there are many claims for power and there are many claims to have greater influence, especially in this kind of hierarchical situation? It's very difficult to think through these kind of plural dimensions, especially at the local scale where they're most meaningful and they're most impactful. And so what we're trying to do is trying to kind of look at what might be the missing link in all this, which is that bioregional scale where national priorities can evolve and translate locally, and where the strong locally developed innovations can thrive. In Canada, there have been some examples of that, including through LOMAs associated with the Oceans Act that we implemented in 2006, but those struggled with sustained capacity and durability, even though they showed that it might be possible that people can come together. Of course, our understanding of those people, their groups, their rights have evolved. And so there needs to be a different look at what that could look like at a bioregional scale. We're focusing on learning from what governance, how governance doesn't work, through a knowledge synthesis grant, where we systematically reviewed the social science and humanities related to governance in both coasts, and are bringing people together to identify, based on, the problems, to identify ways forward, including examples. You can think on the Pacific Coast, of course, about the Marine Partnership Planning, which actually didn't include the federal government at the time that it was really came forward. And so they're out of the loop on that one, and now trying to connect back into it. How is that really going to work? In the Atlantic, there's all sorts of examples of regional governance. For example, on the south coast of Newfoundland, we have communities that are starting to connect back together, realizing that they have resource and capacity issues, which is often a challenge for co-governance with community. Including the federal government now is speaking about their role in different ways that might be different from the past. They're talking about what is actually going to look like for partnership as opposed to us being the governor of the system. And so we're kind of pulling the pieces together from some of those trends and have a great team pulling out some innovations and examples that from which we could draw inspiration. Ultimately, and the last thing I'll say about this is that it's a co-developed partnership. So if we're successful at stage one, we have funding support at stage two to have good, proper engagement so people can share more about what they think is working and what the challenges might be for governance.
That's great. You're doing so much as one team. I do want to make sure if there are any questions from the audience, please pop them into the Q&A box. But as a follow-on to my question, Evan, I was thinking, as you mentioned, that you plan to pilot these innovations and to really test them out. I was curious what that would look like, given the sort of nature of the way the system is designed right now. How can you carry out a pilot in a system that's sort of rigidly defined in a current state? But it sounds like the federal government is already moving in this direction of looking for alternative arrangements and how to work across scales and support efforts more.
Well, I can't speak for them. What I can do is try to read a little bit of the tea leaves with our current Prime Minister, who is looking at kind of smaller government approaches and partnership approaches. And I'm sure, and I always want to compliment the work of people, for example, in Fisheries and Oceans Canada, who are really smart, really well-intentioned, and really ready to push things forward as best as they can. But like them, everybody is in our own kind of institutional mandate, which is kind of the central difficulty of innovating and piloting governance. In fields like the policy sciences and different fields of governance, there are techniques and strategies and processes to pilot different arrangements that are either things in person or even kind of online, where you can get a better understanding of what the pluralism and plural environment is for testing governance. One technique, for example, is to look far into the future with scenario development and comparison, but including the processes that are involved in governance. Another is a decision theater approach. You can imagine a bunch of people sitting in a room with a kind of possible scenario and having to decide, what is this going to look like? Who's going to make decisions? Whose values? Whose rights? To unpack some of the really complicated, tension-filled areas. That's going to be really difficult. But I think with the group that we have and the idea to grow, I think there's a lot of possibility to at least inform what the long-term future of governance systems might look like. And I suppose, in the very least, build some capacity so people can work together.
Mm-hmm. That's great. For the last 4 minutes that we have remaining, I do want to open this up to questions for both speakers. So Jay, if you can come back, thank you. And I would encourage anyone attending to please use the Q&A box and ask any remaining questions that you might have.
Evan, I would love to chat with you more about like these governance structures. They sound so cool.
Mhm. Yeah.
And IU with some of the complex realities in Greenland, it's just an unbelievable topic, and you know, kudos to you for doing such a wonderful job getting in there.
Thank you. I think, I mean, outside of outside of both the Arctic context, when we're talking about fisheries of scale, right, going from like small, what people consider like small scale fisheries, but recognizing like the significant impact that it has in that region, and then comparing it to like high seas fisheries, and they're both still fisheries management, right?
Yeah.
It's it gets real complicated. It's fun, but it's also like hard.
Well, one of the things that I like about starting with this regenerative fisheries topic is that it doesn't presume, at least within Canada's EEZ, it doesn't presume that small or inshore or community-based is more regenerative, more beneficial than mid or offshore fisheries. In fact, in Canada, a diverse fishing portfolio is a key economic strength. So we ought to be looking at all of them together with some of the inspiration from the small scale fisheries and blue justice movements that drive my work, but without prejudging and really taking a good look empirically about what's possible, what's out there, and what they should look like in the future with their participation, of course.
Great. Well, thank you both. I feel like there are probably, I'm looking at the list of attendees, and I know there are people on this list who would love to join this conversation as well, and I know are doing similar and very relevant work. So I hope that, I know this isn't an ideal format for an open discussion, but I do hope that you'll reach out to the speakers and I just want to wrap us up by thanking you all again for joining. The webinar recording and a summary will be available on the FishSCORE website. It takes a couple of days, but it will be there. And there is a link in the chat for that website that will have the recording of this webinar as well as all of our past webinars. So our next webinar will be in late February, and it will be hosted by the FishMIP program, and we'll be sending out further information on that soon. So thank you all, and thank you especially to our speakers today.